Good evening. Many thanks for joining us here tonight. My name is Jonathan Prentice. I'm the director of the London office of International Crisis Group. I'd also like to thank Chatham House for so kindly agreeing to host this event. This is the International Crisis Group list of conflicts to watch in 2017. I think this is the 6th year or so that we have been doing these annual lists, and for this year, as with the others, there is something of a spoiler alert, but only more so than in previous years. It's going to be a very gloomy discussion indeed. In fact, I think the extent of the global uncertainty that we're all facing means that this list could be much longer. You'll see here not just the 10 countries that we have selected for 2017, but also the overlap with the previous year. And in fact, 6 of the conflicts or crises on this year's list appear on that for 2016, namely Syria and Iraq, Turkey, Yemen, the Lake Chad Basin, South Sudan, and Afghanistan. The new entries are Myanmar, Ukraine, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Mexico, replacing, so to speak, Burundi, Libya, South China Seas, and Colombia, of which I think the first 3 would have a very strong claim to being highlighted this year. And indeed, if we go back to the list for 2015, we see that 4 of its entries have appeared every year since, namely Syria, Iraq again, South Sudan, Afghanistan, and Yemen. Ukraine and the Democratic Republic of Congo appeared that year. We bumped them off last year, but they've managed to climb back on this year. Nigeria and Libya and the Sahel, in one form or another, have appeared in each list, I think reflecting the shape-shifting nature of those crises. And the remaining 2 from 2015, Somalia and Venezuela, would have a strong claim to appear as regulars themselves. Add to this, I think, other notable omissions. The 2 NKs, North Korea and Nagorno-Karabakh, for example. We included just last month the Central African Republic in a note that we submitted to the now new Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And you see that these lists could be as long or as different one from the other as we would like them to be. So beyond that inherent malleability about these lists, what does all this say? Well, I think a number of things. One is the repeat appearances point to ongoing deficiencies in how we manage conflict. That much perhaps isn't new. Many of these conflicts possess regional dynamics. They are internal wars in which there are many internal dimensions which complicate their resolution extremely. And perhaps this trend looks set to intensify amidst this deepening uncertainty that we're all witnessing, particularly, I think, the assumption of a stable north that can maybe no longer be quite the given that it once was. Fourthly, many of these conflicts or crises have within them, to varying degrees, a continued focus on terrorism and counter-terrorism and the challenges addressed in dealing with that phenomenon. And finally, many of our recommendations, I think, reflective of the complexity of the world we're facing today, focus on not making matters worse. They focus more on that than on grand solutions. And it may be the case that we are seeing over the past month, certainly, that the much derided Obama mantra of don't do stupid shit is going to be looked at with a lot more fondness than was perhaps the case when he made that pronouncement last year. Now, my final words of introduction are that dying rock stars aside, we may look back on 2016 not so much as a bad year in and of itself, but rather as a year when the building blocks were put in place for some really bad things to happen moving forward. And that willing the best to happen no longer presents a coherent strategy. Indeed, you know, as Thucydides said, well, he didn't say it in English, hope is an expensive commodity, and it's much better to be prepared. Now, to help us prepare ourselves is Mark Malloch-Brown, the chairman of International Crisis Group, who has one of those biographies that needs no introduction and is depressingly and intimidatingly long, so I won't talk you through it. But before I hand over to him, I would simply like to flag also that I have two colleagues in the audience, Joost Hilterman, who's the director of Crisis Group's MENA work, and Ronaldo de Pan, who is the director of our West Africa work, and it is to them whom we will be turning all the difficult country-specific questions after Mark has spoken. So Mark, over to you. How do we prepare for 2017?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. And actually, that was a gloriously mild introduction. I thought when you started talking about dying rock stars, that it was a neat segue into me. I'm rather disappointed. I think the year begins with inevitably the phenomenon, as Jonathan has just said, of the Trump presidency. And, you know, one word at this stage characterizes that presidency, 10 days old though it only is, and that is uncertainty. On the one hand, you know, I was at Davos in the days leading up to his inauguration, and one great American corporate titan after another waddled their way to the Davos stage to insist that it was all going to be all right, that really he was a mainstream Republican who'd had to campaign in this strange populist way in order to win, but look out, he'd now revert to the mean, to the center. Well, you know, I think many of us were skeptical then, and 10 days in, I doubt many of those Republicans could be persuaded, or business leaders could be persuaded, to repeat that assertion, because he has, in this first week or so in office, governed exactly as he promised to in the campaign. But of course, that means, therefore, that the key word is uncertainty, because if you look across all the global spheres where he has promised action, it is very unclear whether he will be able to carry the day with the promises of the campaign, or whether he will run into the buffers of a Republican Congress, of the more traditional Republican appointments who do populate the senior national security cabinet posts of defense and state. So, you know, for example, on the Middle East, will his promises to move the embassy to Jerusalem, to tilt decisively in favor of Israel, will his ability to do a deal with President Putin over Syria, will all these things completely realign our current sort of expectations of Middle East policy? Will he, with Mexico, really be able to carry through on the wall and the renegotiation of NAFTA in quite the radical terms that we've anticipated, on China and Asia relations? Again, will he be able to prevail over more traditional voices which will resist picking of quarrels with China in terms of China's immediate sea lanes around the South and East China Sea Islands issues, let alone on trade and Taiwan? You know, perhaps the biggest question of all is, will he be able to reset relations with Putin and Russia? For Europe and NATO, huge consequential outcomes if any of those things do happen. And for the crisis group countries, which tend not to be, the exception of Mexico, perhaps always in that frontier, you know, what is the knock-on effect into the secondary regions where we've located our conflicts for 2017. And there are several sort of general trends, if you like, which we can point to. One is that, probably tough for all emerging markets, because we're going to see some degree of capital repatriation to the United States, both by demand, but also by the increased opportunity that a fiscal stimulus will create there. And then, of course, this banning of travelers and from the 7 countries that has happened this weekend. These are all top crisis group priority countries, and suddenly thrown into the center of the storm by this extraordinary executive action, which will clearly put huge new tensions into US relations with each of the 7. So, in a sense, the Trump phenomenon is unlikely to stop with the big countries, if you like, or the big geopolitical issues. It will have ramifications and ripple through the kind of our list of conflict countries and all the countries where crisis group is active and following the conflicts or near conflicts in those territories. And I think the first thing we're going to see is, a view in these 7, but in many others as well, that the hypocrisy of or double standards that has often characterized US and Western policy in the Middle East is now going to become a wider phenomenon, because it is very, very hard to argue, if you accept the premise of the Trump executive order, that this was intended to be a security measure against potential sources of terrorism. It's very hard, if you believe that, to understand why Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Afghanistan were not on the list. However, if you don't believe it and you see this was entirely politics and not security, then the list probably makes sense. Much easier targets without the political means to mount the same kind of lobby in Washington that, say, Saudi Arabia would have been able to raise if it had been on the list. But these are 7 countries whose nationals have not been responsible for any terrorist incident in the US since 9/11, who've all been targeted, versus other countries which tragically have had their nationals caught up in incidents, who seem to get away scot-free in this list. So, we're going to see increasing doubts about the kind of, if you like, the straightforwardness of American policy demands. Nothing new, but further exaggerated, I fear, by this order. And so, as we move on from this, I think to the non-Trump dimensions of 2017, the tendency looked at through the eyes of Europeans has been to tend to sort of draw a line from Brexit to Trump and ask where next in terms of elections in France, Germany, Italy, Holland, which lie ahead. But to be honest, if you come from the perspective of the International Crisis Group, following conflicts globally, Trump may not have been the first or second in a line of falling dominoes of the old liberal international political order, but frankly just the latest in the much longer series, which has gone sort of almost unnoticed, of what I call the rise of the Caesars. In a world where you have Presidents Putin and Xi of China, Prime Minister Modi of India, President Erdogan of Turkey, President Duterte of the Philippines, we already have a huge chunk of humankind having fallen into the rulership of leaders who are at the authoritarian end of the spectrum of their particular political systems, with often less respect for domestic rule of law, for constitutional nicety than those who came before them, or indeed even themselves in earlier phases of their own rule. So something strange is happening out there. Trump is not the beginning, but just the latest of a general trend towards more authoritarian, less tolerant, less respectful of at least norms and of legal norms, but human rights norms, than leadership 5 or 10 years ago. And so let me just dwell for a moment, because for the crisis group, in terms of dealing with these conflicts, the rule of law, but also the international institutions like the UN or the European Union are critical partners and actors in our vision of how conflicts are mitigated or avoided. And 2017 doesn't look like a great year for these kinds of institutions. We've focused here in the UK, the Brexit end of the thing is the implications and consequences of Brexit for the UK. But I think, we have to look equally strongly at the consequences for Europe and for the institutions of Brussels. They are, in a sense, shaken to the core by the processes triggered by Brexit, but which don't stop there. So we see a much more introverted, less sure of itself Europe, much less willing to project itself internationally around the soft power agenda for which it has become so well known in recent years. You then turn to NATO. And I have to say, and I think many in this room would agree, that probably one of the few foreign policy points on which I think Trump scores a genuinely earned direct hit is his claim that NATO really, that the European members of NATO have simply not carried their fair share of the costs of NATO. So at the very time that Europe is sort of losing ground as a political entity, it faces the prospect of having to dig much deeper into its pockets in terms of the share of NATO costs. And will it dig? Probably it may have to, in terms of the changing Russia-US relationship and the risk that Russia poses more of a direct threat to Europe than in a long time. But for the United Nations, which, along with Europe, is so critical, whether it is, with development projects, projecting peacekeepers and others into many of the conflicts that Jonathan mentioned, this is also a time of great uncertainty, with rumors around Washington reported in the New York Times only to then be qualified or challenged by administration sources. But something is clearly brewing in terms of an attack on the UN, if not by the administration, then there's already proposed legislation by Senators Graham and Cruz to, cut US funding to the UN in a pretty dramatic way. So again, real consequences for the effectiveness and resource of the UN in terms of dealing with international issues. And you then, for years in this room, there have been references to the Chicago speech of Prime Minister Blair. I think probably Prime Minister May deserves a reference to the Philadelphia speech of last week, because, while I think in many ways many welcome the prospect that there will be no more, if you like, sort of unplanned interventions of the kind that we saw in Afghanistan, and more Iraq, but also Afghanistan and Libya, open-ended interventions without clear exit strategies where the costs were in no way weighed against the benefits. Nevertheless, hers appeared to be a blanket retreat from the kind of conflict prevention strategies that have become so much part of the international system in recent years, a sharp, perhaps overswing of the pendulum from Chicago of that speech of some years earlier. And of course, very unclear where Trump really comes down on this. Again, rumors that he has contemplated, although for now rejected, safe havens and no-fly zones in Syria, which, again, how does that fit with an apparent desire not to repeat the mistakes of Iraq? Turn quickly to China, which has become in Davos, if you like, the likely replacement of the US as guarantor of an international liberal order, if you were to believe President Xi's very well received speech in Davos. But of course, it's a selective version of what we are used to, with a focus on a open commercial international order, but much less attention to the human rights and other dimensions of that liberal order to which we had become accustomed to enjoying American leadership for. So we're moving into a time of great uncertainty where to guide the conflicts that we've focused on becomes, in a way, a lot harder. And it's worth perhaps in that sense just saying a word about, the damage already to US soft power, the bully pulpit role that the country has so effectively played in over many years. And, I can sort of see it in an ever widening circle of countries since President Trump's election. Governments and their militaries just tipping to being slightly stronger than they would have previously been, whether it is the government in Naypyidaw coming down rather harder on the Rohingya and the Rakhine State issues than was the case a few months ago, whether it is in Malaysia an increasing crackdown on opposition, whether it's a growing confidence in Khartoum, and similarly a growing confidence in southern Sudan, in Juba, about the need not to have to sort of deal with opposition as accommodating way as in the past. Or in Yemen, a suspicion that perhaps the Saudis are now less worried about constraints on their ability to prosecute the war in Yemen, or if there are constraints, they're much more Saudi domestic ones anymore than emanating out of Washington. Even in the DRC, a suspicion that President Kabila may suspect that there will be an easing of pressure on him to honor the terms of the transition that he's just agreed to. And, in Ukraine, a suspicion that pro-Russian groups may well start to flex their muscle in a much more clear way than before. So, what one's seeing is huge new challenges, specific and generalized to conflicts of the kind that the crisis group has listed. And that's before, and I've deliberately not got to the local roots of each of those conflicts. I imagine we'll get to them in the question period of this. But I felt it was probably more useful to set this sort of global context in which we have to struggle to mediate these conflicts. And, already last year, we began this year with a somewhat pessimistic view of the environment in which these conflicts would be handled. I have to say, a year later, for us in the crisis group, it just looks significantly worse. And, it's a grim silver lining to conclude that what we started with the crisis group 20 years ago, of an organization which would seek to put the spotlight on the crises that others didn't notice, to try and build the will to tackle the conflicts by outlining policy options available to do so, that kind of championing of forgotten people and forgotten conflicts today looks ever more important than ever. But the cast of actors for us to influence and press to bring these conflicts to resolution look more distracted, more disorganized, more divided than almost any time in the crisis group's 21 years of life. Thank you.
Well, thank you indeed, Mark. Now, I'm going to open up for questions. If, when I pick you, you could give your name and affiliation, but you have to wait until the microphone is with you, otherwise no one will hear. I was told I had to say that, or I'd be in trouble. Okay, gentleman in the second row there, and another gentleman with the blue shirt over there. Yes, please.
My name is John Preston. I'm a member of Chatham House and the European movement. I've got two probably unrelated questions. The first one is it possible to distinguish between a source of trouble that can be contained or automatically contains itself and trouble brewing in a country that is likely to spread afield? I don't wish to sound facetious about the EU, but we had a talk this morning that was very disturbing about the way in which societies that we took for granted as being stable and convergent in their behaviour seem to be going in the Trump direction, as it were. And if you've got Trump on one side and Putin on the other, whether they're getting closer together could create anxiety in the EU, which would have a destabilising effect.
Yes, I'll take a bunch of questions. Then the gentleman over there in the blue shirt, and then gentleman in the middle here.
Thank you. My name is Diego Salama. I'm from the United Nations University. I want to turn your attention to UN peacekeepers, particularly those in South Sudan. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think that peacekeepers are equipped in terms of mandate and actual equipment and troops to deal with the crisis in South Sudan, but also the crisis in Congo? And to what extent is it realistic to expect that the UN Security Council will give them the necessary tools in the coming year to deal with these crises? Thank you.
Then in the middle there, and then Patricia at the back, and then I think we'll stop after that.
Thank you very much indeed. Ewan Grant, I'm now an independent border control and risk consultant. I was a law enforcement intelligence analyst covering the ex-Soviet countries, and I've worked in Ukraine, Yemen, and most recently West Africa, where I very much noticed how deep and subtle and more all-embracing China's involvement is. It's not just the stuff we hear on the surface. My question is based on certain experiences of the problem of liaison between public servants and contractors in international support. Who is listening to the message you're putting out and who isn't? And whether there's any particular differences within regions or on topics. Because I do remember hearing a few weeks ago at Chatham House, a gentleman in the library, just as I was leaving, I think he was probably ex-military, and he warned a few NGO people. He said, not all NGOs like the military. And I think there's a gap that needs to be brought together. Thank you.
Thanks. Patricia Lewis, Research Director for International Security at Chatham House. So we've been here before throughout human history with instability in different places. Thinking back to 100 years ago, we were in some very difficult situations. 70 years ago, similarly. But we've put in place a number of institutions, having learned from that, of which Chatham House is one, and there are many others, international bodies, intergovernmental organizations, and so on. So what have we learned that we can use now to prevent the instability leading to conflict?
Okay, shall I?
Please.
Look, I think on the EU question first, I mean, it is quite clear that in my list of Caesars, I should probably include Prime Minister Orban of Hungary. and arguably the leadership of Poland as well. Although actually politically they're in very different places in terms of their relations towards Russia. And in that sense, this could be eating away at Europe from inside, this phenomenon. And if some of the elections in Western Europe go spectacularly wrong during the course of the year, then we're even in much deeper trouble. But when you list all these people together that I've mentioned, these leaders inside Europe, but also outside Europe, across regions, really, strange. In a sort of perverse kind of way, the region that used to traditionally provide strongmen, Latin America, is almost the most absent from my list actually today. But if you look at this Asian, European, North American list of Caesars, you are left with a sort of fairly profound question of what has gone wrong with democratic political society that it's producing this kind of outcome. And I think it forces us to a period of introspection, which ain't going to be solved in the next couple of minutes by me, because I think in a way, whatever is the combination of whatever globalization has triggered and whatever new social media forms have triggered and whatever is happening to the world of employment, something pretty profound is underway, where we seem to be unlearning what we thought was ironclad commitment to pluralistic, open society. And that should be a cause of, I think, great concern to all of us. On the UN peacekeeping point, the Obama administration was finally 7 years in, starting to grasp the nettle of really making peacekeeping more effective. It's for years been an under-resourced, under-armed, under-trained, under-equipped sort of peacekeeping on the cheap. And when I was Deputy Secretary General, I fought very hard to get more resource into raising the quality of peacekeeping, and was batted away by Brits and Americans who didn't want the budgetary consequences of it. And the Obama people got along with the UK and others, got very serious about this towards the end of his term. But in this new environment, you have to anticipate that there is just not going to be the additional resource for peacekeeping that it badly needs. So, I fear that, we may get stronger mandates written, but they won't be properly resourced. And, so in both South Sudan and DRC, we'll have a continuing anomaly of expectations being loaded onto peacekeepers, which they're not equipped to deliver on, and with really serious consequences as a consequence. To the point about contractors, military, NGOs, it's always been a fraught set of relationships. It goes back a long way, and I think in many ways the military have earned their spurs with a lot of their NGO critics by their efficiency in delivery in terms of humanitarian crisis and the indispensability of their roles in peacekeeping. But it just needs an intervention that goes awry, and the old suspicions and distrusts resume, and it is difficult often to establish that the military are acting for entirely humanitarian motives and don't have some separate political agenda to the humanitarian NGOs. So, I suspect it's a relationship which is always going to remain fraught and difficult, and constantly require marriage guidance counselling to keep it together. To Patricia, and the very good point about the fact we've been here before, my answer would be we've nearly been here before, in that in each of those time frames you mention, the world needed to go to the abyss before it gathered the vision and the political will to put in place the institutions to recover from that and build an international system which worked and had some robustness to it. And, you know, in that sense, I'm afraid we're at the beginning of the march to the abyss, not at the abyss. And, you know, while I very much hope and don't think it's ruled out that, you know, President Trump will sober up and, you know, the forces around him in Washington will, you know, force a more conventional foreign policy on him. And that similarly, you know, President Xi's desire for a stable global trading economy and a complete faith, I suspect in his case, that peace is a much better environment for China to advance its economic agenda than war, that, you know, the interests that various people, governments, institutions, and others have in sustaining a peaceful world will triumph over the sort of erratic behaviors and rise of my Caesars. But, you know, if it doesn't, I fear that things will have to get worse before we reach one of those collective points where we form a new United Nations, let alone a new Chatham House. So we'll have to see. I think everything's in play this year. We either patch things up and continue with the system we know, and it recovers, or things deteriorate very significantly to the point where a new generation of leadership is willing to pool sovereignty and interests to a point that we can either reboot the UN or create new, more appropriate international institutions for the times.
If I can just come in there, I think one of the great uncertainties, I mean, Mark was right that this is a prevailing atmosphere of uncertainty, is much will depend upon what the first crisis is, I suspect, on the watch of the new administration in Washington, how they respond to it and what lessons they draw from it. And that's to some extent, well, not to some extent, that is outside of our control. I think the argument there, to take the UN, for example, as to why it is in the US interest to be a team player in the United Nations is compelling. The problem is we are dealing with the politics of the new administration rather than the alternative facts of reality, shall we say. But I think those arguments are worth continuing to make, whether they are on the sort of frameworks of counterterrorism that the UN has been extremely useful in, or on the Paris Climate Change Conference that has been one of the few bright lights of recent times. Turning to the UN point, if I can just supplement Mark, you know, I think one of the things that the new Secretary General seems to be doing is trying to really think through how these missions are put together in the future, from the political side through to the peacekeeping, through to the humanitarian and development. And there, I think he has some strong ideas. He's put a strong team around him to try and think through those. And I hope, and it's certainly something that Crisis Group has been calling for in a number of missions, whether that be the DRC or South Sudan, as you mentioned, but also Central African Republic. Mali is for a much more clear, sometimes simplified mandate structure and the resources to carry that out. So I hope, you know, and one of the bright spots of last year, despite his gender, was the appointment of this Secretary General. And I think he is going to bring a degree of dynamic change there that will be augur well. Yes, lady there.
Anita Panwani, risk advisor. On the subject of the UN, do you think had there been greater reforms in the governance and particularly the composition of the Security Council, that it would have been more fit for purpose in terms of handling the nature of global challenges that we're facing?
And the gentleman right in the very front row here, and then I'm going to...
Richard Sanders, member of Chatham House and emeritus professor at the University of Northampton. I'm particularly concerned with the possibility, if there is a possibility of an abyss, it might be over North Korea at the moment. I mean, particularly given the testimony of the very high-ranking member of the North Korean embassy who has been here in Chatham House several times that we've spoken to, a friend of Chatham House. What he said about Kim Jong-un and whether you perceive Kim Jong-un yet as one of your young Caesars and the potentiality for the abyss over North Korea.
There's a gentleman right behind you. I am not focusing on this section. I don't mean to discriminate. I just don't see any other hands at this stage.
Hello, Pedro Solares. I'm also a member here. Depressing as it may sound, wouldn't it be better to forget the last 70 years of progress and start thinking about what it was like before that period, which was an unusual period of progress, liberalization, income equality, etc., all the things we know from our lifetime, at least in my lifetime. And going forward, perhaps we should think more defensively and less comprehensively, and certainly worry more about our immediate neighborhood than the world. Thank you.
Okay, should we
Should I
take
take
those now?
I completely agree that if there had been UN Security Council reform, it would have created a little bit more protection against the prospect of US sharply cutting things. Although, of course, the allocation of the division of budget would have broadly remained unchanged. So, one way or another, the US was going to be 22% of the regular and 28% of the peacekeeping. So, and has this is what's so frustrating always about the US and the UN. I mean, it views the UN as an alien institution on its soil. Anyone else at the UN views the UN as too much in the pocket of the US. And so it does have disproportionate influence, and a lot of that, frankly, very, very, very good influence. Whether it was Eleanor Roosevelt at the beginning on the human rights side. I mean, the US can be very proud of its contribution to the United Nations, and therefore, all the more tragic if it pulls back. But just an anecdote. I was talking to a senior member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which at the beginning appeared, disappointed not to have the US as a member, to have the UK and many others as a member, and about to admit 23 more members. Their state of relief that they don't have Trump's US in their institution is huge, because they actually think there's a prospect they're going to make this institution really hum, because they think there'll be agreement and consensus and a group of countries, global countries, driving in the same direction of, a better set of infrastructure for the world. On the North Korea point, absolutely. I mean, I think, it is obviously alarming when you have a North Korea which has reached the stage of nuclear development it has now reached, with at least the claim that it could land a missile on the American West Coast within a year. For that to coincide with a sort of a new US presidency of any kind would be hard enough. I mean, there was a terrible transition from Clinton to Bush, as I'm sure you recall, where, the steady progress under Clinton got completely turned back by Bush. And so I kind of hope that there are one or two sort of people who remember that, who are serving in the new administration, who will do their best to try and prevent the worst flipping back of the clock. But, the difficulty is that successful, effective handling of North Korea by the US requires strong understanding with China. I mean, it's very, very hard, obviously, if those two are at odds on other issues, to successfully manage North Korea. So that, combined with the political meltdown in South Korea, makes this a very, very, very tricky flashpoint for the coming year. I agree with that. And on the points there about the depressing reality, I think I'm sorry to say, I think you're right, that I think we will be thinking a lot more locally and regionally in the coming period rather than globally. It's not that I think the integration of economic trade is going to be thrown into some dramatic reverse, not at all. But I think, the politics of that integration is going to be severely disrupted for a while. And we just have to accept that and, recognize that there'll be a lot more regional and local politics coming to the fore.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. Nick Harris, member here at Chatham House. I look at the map up there, and you say this is the sort of the most troubling time in the 21 years. I'm in my mid-40s, and most of those places seem to have been in chaos for all of my adult life. I look at somewhere like Afghanistan, DRC, Lake Chad Basin. We got to sort of almost take the approach that some of these problems aren't going to be solved, and there's been an awful lot of blood and treasure that has been expended and hasn't got us anywhere. And maybe it is time to change the approach, and the more regional one that you were mentioning might be the answer. I look at some of the African Union peacekeeping activities seem to be far more effective than some of the UN ones that were there before.
So in the centre here.
Thank you. I'm a member of Richard Woods, a member of Chatham House. Prompted by the last question, I'm 75. And in 1965, a friend of mine and I drove a Land Rover from England to India. And while it was quite adventurous, it didn't occur to us or our parents that there was anything particularly dangerous about it. And you look at the route we took, Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, through the middle of Afghanistan, not even on either of the main roads, northwest Pakistan. The only border we couldn't cross was into India because Pakistan was at war with India. How do you have any thoughts on how we might see that whole area of what is now unstable and often dangerous territory evolving over the next 5 or 10 years?
And one at the back.
There at the very back.
Hello, Stefan Chibian, Chatham House. I wanted to ask about the US and maybe what is your perspective on the popular reaction to Trump's policies and whether there is prospect for instability coming on from the population. Also, I was wondering if about your thoughts on Ethiopia and the situation there. And lastly, there is an increasingly new phenomenon of fake news that is alarming around the world. How do you see this phenomenon affecting the situations in Europe and the US? Thank you.
All right, let me take those if I may. I mean, first point well taken about this looks like a list that could have been put up at any time, most of it, in the last 10, 15 years. And but in a way, my point wasn't addressed to saying, these rather overlooked, forgotten crises constitute the most dangerous world of our times, or period in world history in our times. It was more that the overall global environment amounts to that. And, in my day life, I, work quite a bit with Eurasia, one of the commercial political risk things, and we do a list of 10 countries as well. And, they're very different to these because they're not the forgotten crises. They're, in those cases, the crises that impact markets. And let me tell you, there's a hair-raising list of those for 2017 as well. And I, touched on some of them because it's issues like the Middle East, etc. So my evidence for these being dangerous times is not this map. And, actually, when we started the crisis group, which was around collapsing Yugoslavia, our business model or operating model was pretty clear, which was Yugoslavia is falling apart. There is massive ethnic conflict going on. We have to persuade NATO and others to intervene to stop it. And so you wrote a great report and you delivered it to some people in Washington and in NATO headquarters in Brussels who read your report, were persuaded or not by what you had to say, and indeed intervened and stopped it. And that model of a sort of not so hidden global hand willing to intervene to try and end conflicts was very much there. Now, you're quite right. There were a lot of conflicts that didn't end as a consequence, but there were many who did. And so my point this evening was only each of these conflicts has got, tough local domestic roots of its own. What's changed is the ability of the international system to effectively combine to address them. And therefore, to your second point, I agree that often it is local neighborhood solutions that work. I mean, the very week that Mrs. May in Philadelphia was condemning interventionism, one of the most successful interventions of recent years occurred, which was the ECOWAS intervention in Gambia. It had all the things that Cameron and Blair's interventions didn't have. Proportionality, a clear objective which was attainable with a appropriate use or threat of use of force, and a clear exit strategy to get a bad guy out and put the man who'd won the elections into the presidency. And so there are, and so in that sense, I would say that we are seeing, particularly in Africa at the moment, some much more sophisticated local solution management or conflict management than often elsewhere. And we might get a second opinion on that from the front row in a moment. But just on the second one of the Land Rover to the subcontinent, well, my first advice is, don't tell your grandchildren in their gap year to repeat your adventure.
One of my sons did it too.
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, a famous sort of Michael Keating, who many of you here know, brought his 4 daughters home from Pakistan in a painted Land Rover. And whenever I see these girls, I shake my head and I look at them and say, you already are living on borrowed time. But obviously that this is a corridor of deteriorating relations and stability, and a conflict which has fed on itself and whose borders and boundaries has expanded. And I think what we have seen, in many of the countries on that route is an arc of conflict which has grown precisely because, in a prudent way, there was not an addressing of the conflict in earlier stages. So we've seen the Middle East metastasize from Israeli-Palestinian conflict to one which has consumed country after country, not in a direct linear way, but because, Sunni and Shia conflicts were not managed or mitigated or resolved, and the people who might have helped resolve them had lost credibility and legitimacy because of their position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so this thing has built upon itself and fed upon itself in a way which would now make a Land Rover trip very dangerous indeed. And you know, if ever there is a region which makes the case for early intervention and conflict prevention, I think it is that one. Turning very quickly to the US, I mean, President Trump at the moment, his popularity numbers are down to about 37%, I think, you know, which is uniquely low for a new president. But, you know, what he has done is harden his base with his early activities. I mean, this is a guy who was elected on a 54% electoral turnout in the US, so essentially 25% of Americans voted for him. And, you know, but in that situation, he's governing towards his base. It's a very unusual strategy. Most presidents, once elected, move to the center and try to co-opt and build on the constituency they have. Whether he will continue in the way he's began, I hesitate to predict, but it seems, if he does, one which is likely to put him at odds at least with his Republican allies, because it's very hard for them in the midterms to win elections off that base. On Ethiopia, I mean, it's, you know, it's a strange situation because obviously people like myself with a development background are huge fans of the Ethiopian development model and the success that it's brought, and increasingly alarmed by the politics of the country. But, you know, it does have a leadership which, you know, is not immune to the political challenges it's facing, which is, you know, tried to make concessions to Oromo areas outside Addis and to do some other things to try and accommodate the opposition threat to it. Where this will end, I really hesitate to guess. But, you know, the stakes are evidently very high because this has been a huge economic development success story. But, you know, for how long that continue at the price of growing groups of the country feeling politically disenfranchised is hard to know. And on your fake news point, you know, we could be here all night. It's a disaster for all of us who believe in, you know, kind of real news and real journalism. It's dismaying what's happening.
Just if I may, a quick footnote on the composition of the list. I don't want to sound defensive, but I actually disagree. I think I disagree with you as well.
You're allowed to.
In the sense that I don't think these 10 would have been there for years. If you look at Afghanistan, yes, I concede that point. Myanmar, South Sudan. The others, they may have been scenes of immense underdevelopment, immensely neglectful governments, particularly when it comes to centre and periphery, poor human rights records, sporadic outbreaks of violence, but entrenched, open conflict that drags in neighbours. I'm not sure I would concede that point. And I think for every Gambia, we have a Yemen and Afghanistan, South Sudan, Syria's Iraq, where they may not view their neighbours' actions quite as favourably. And I think the list is less a collection of 10 individual crises and more a reflection of how we are seeing the state of the world today. And I think on that front, it is qualitatively worse. And of course, we're not a quantitative organisation, but all the data bears that out. Right. The world is getting more violent. It's why we can't take those wonderful car trips
can
anymore.
We have just a word from
yes.
a real Africa expert rather than a complete...
Well, on the mediation in West Africa, well, we have a good example. That's something that could be a little bit more developed. So we had previously this successful intervention of the ECOWAS in Guinea-Bissau, and now this intervention in the Gambia. with a mix between a diplomatic effort and a bit of military or fish showing. That really works. And we also have in West Africa this very good UNOWAS, the UN Agency for West Africa, that does also a very good job when it comes to mediate crises. And they were successful in the mediation of the electoral crisis in Guinea. Now the problem is, when you are in front of people, especially people living in the peripheries who are not very keen to talk to you, like Al-Qaeda, for instance, or Boko Haram. And then on the military or the force side of things, it's very difficult when you have something that is bigger than the organization itself. For instance, a large, vast territory like Mali. ECOWAS can't guarantee peace there. It's too big for its means. As for the AU, perhaps they will do like the ECOWAS did. I mean, the ECOWAS did a lot of progress since 25 years. Remember that ECOWAS began its peacemaking operation with the catastrophic example of Liberia in the early 90s. And since ECOWAS did a better and better job. I mean, what I wrote 2 days ago in a report, and it's a recommendation addressed to Niger, is, start to think to sort out the problem by yourself. Because in the coming months and years, you will have both countries or Western partners that will run out of money, or that will disengage and adopt a very isolationist trend. That's it. I don't want to give some good news. Well, one other good news on West Africa, and I like that one. The new leader or the new president in Burkina Faso in December has been asked why he wasn't enough authoritarian. And he said, being a chief, it's not being a dictator. And I think it's one of the good news of the evening. Thank you.
There you go. Crisis Group can do good news. I think we have time for one more round of questions. The gentleman there has been very patient, and there in the back in the centre, and then the lady here in the front. Yes, please.
Thanks. Ivan Sedgwick, member here. Earlier today, we had Guy Verhofstadt on the subject of NATO, conceding both that NATO punched significantly below its weight and an expense, but also saying there was absolutely no chance of the European countries responding to Trump's pressure by actually spending any more on it. If that's the case, will that contribute to the spreading of your nasty brown mark from the Ukraine up into the Baltic?
And there was someone here in the...
Can I? I'm Paul Newman. I'm a member of Chatham House. I'm also a director of a city firm called Next Group. Mark, thank you very much for your presentation. I want to ask you, I'm sure we all really enjoyed the emerging Caesars idea, but surely you mentioned that, of course, you of course mentioned that Trump is the next in line in a series of these, but I think we'd all agree that this one's a bit different. I mean, for the first time, we have an emerging Caesar that is not only supposedly leader of the Western world, but of course one elected with whether or not we like it, a democratic mandate. And of course, your remarks about the 54% remind us that we've got a similar issue in Brexit, but it is what it is. So my question really is, what's different about this kind of emerging Caesar compared to the other ones?
And there's a lady here in the third row in the centre block.
Thank you. Alia Mubayed from the IISS. I mean, the question is a bit following up on the NATO question, but with a bit of a difference. If, as you just said, that part of the difficulty of the international system of accommodating these multiplicity of crises is increasingly squeezed by the lack of available resources because the US wants to withdraw or curtail. I mean, clearly, Jeff Sachs today just wrote an article on sort of the America First balance sheet, where he's arguing that the efforts to save 2% of GDP and what the Trump administration's proposal will amount from the UN organizations or other could save them 2 percentage points of GDP per year. That's significant when they are trying to move towards a fiscal stimulus. So the question is, if that happens, I mean, what could be Plan B? I mean, do you have a sense of what other countries is the international system or individual countries or countries who care about preserving peace and security, do they have a Plan B? Have they started to act? And what would be your recommendations to do?
Well, tough one to finish on. But on the first NATO point, I mean, I'm sure that liberal centre-left European politicians believe that we're not going to respond to Trump's demand that we spend more on NATO. However, I think, if indeed relations with Russia continue to deteriorate, we will spend more on NATO. I just think the threat will regrettably reach a point where European politics responds to it, and it becomes an electoral issue to increase defence spending. At the moment, we're obviously quite away from that. But I think we'll just have to adjust. Obviously the alternative, which if President Trump was here, he would argue it won't be necessary because I'm going to, reset the Russian relationship, and we're going to have a kind of new Yalta, which is going to set a peace across Europe, which will make increased NATO spending unnecessary and redundant. Obviously one has to hope he's right, but assume he may not be. Secondly, on what makes Trump different from the other Caesars, well, he's the only one who owns a casino, but his isn't Caesar's, I suppose. No, obviously it is in that way different, just because of the, I find it quite ironic. I mean, people have sat on platforms like Chatham House in recent years and bemoaned the reduction in American power and influence in the world. And all it takes is a president who probably is going to reduce American power and influence in the world for people like myself to jump up on the stage and implicitly acknowledge that American power and influence still was there. It's only now that it's going to get diminished. And I think that is what is different, because, actually President Duterte in the Philippines, is a much more alarming variant even than President Trump. And, I think some of the things that Prime Minister Modi has done in India, while much milder than President Trump, but something like the dramatic withdrawal of the larger denomination rupee note, was in its way as disruptive to the Indian economy as some of the things Trump has done early on. So I think in a way there are other leaders who in certain regards come close to Trump, but what's different is the global impact of Trump, because of the continued extraordinary sort of first amongst equal standing of the US in global diplomacy and security. Which brings me on to the sort of Plan B point. I mean, I think we're still at a point, you could say it's one of the early stages of grief to which we have not yet reconciled ourselves. But I think, everybody's Plan B at the moment is to hope to re-steer America into a more sensible traditional mode, where, you get a much better combination of, I think Trump continuing to provide a challenge and disruption to the system, but combining it with a lot more sort of stability and gravitas and weight in terms of not betraying a set of relationships in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere, which have underpinned world order in recent years. So, you know, I think, you know, on the one hand, you have to say for Trump that whether it is NATO or, you know, a continuous failure in the Middle East, while his prescriptions may not be right, I think he is perfectly within his rights to challenge the success of recent global foreign policy. And so you can imagine where he throws up those challenges, he forces some rethinks, he forces some adjustments, but the basic system holds. And for now, I think that is plan B. And anything more profound and radical than that in terms of, for example, as some suggest, the UN falling back on China as the major sort of power at that institution, or NATO rapidly rearming to replace the US as the main security provider in Europe. You know, these are not plausible alternatives in the next 5 or 10 years. So, you know, making Trump's America rethink remains our, if you like, best global strategy, combined with, as I think a number of people have said, you know, perhaps a healthy recognition, whether you're in the Gambia or Yemen, that you're going to have to try and find a lot more homegrown solutions, whether it's trying to persuade the Saudis and the Iranians to back off, or, you know, whatever it is, that we are in an era where there's going to need to be a lot more self-help while the world sorts itself out.
Well, soothsayer that I am, I did anticipate that this would be a gloomy evening. So much so that my plan B is to go see La La Land straight after this, which I have been told is very uplifting. The show's at 8:30. You're welcome to join me. But before we leave, can you thank Mark Malloch-Brown for...